Hello and welcome to Valley Girls, the bi-weekly podcast exploring everything there is to see, do, try, eat, and experience in New York's Hudson Valley by talking to the makers, the doers, the growers, the creators, and all the unique voices of the Hudson Valley. I'm Jenny Leifer.
And I'm Jennifer Santiago, and together as the Valley Girls, we're telling the Hudson Valley story one episode at a time. We're so happy you're here.
Welcome to another episode of Valley Girls. It's still March, and we're still celebrating Women's History Month. This week, I'm so excited to welcome back Rabbi Sivan Rotholz. If you listened to our holiday storytime episode back in December, you heard Sivan telling us the story of Judith, the unsung heroine of Hanukkah. We loved her storytelling so much that we just had to invite her back. Sivan is the rabbi and director of adult education at Central Synagogue in Manhattan and honorary rebbitzin and guest teacher at Congregation Emmanuel of the Hudson Valley right here in Kingston. For those not familiar with the term, rebbitzin is a Yiddish word and is a title given to the partner or spouse of the rabbi of a synagogue. In traditional or Orthodox communities, the rebbitzin may have certain roles in the community. Reform Judaism embraces more egalitarian principles, and the role of the rebbitzin has evolved. In Reform progressive synagogues, such as Congregation Emmanuel of the Hudson Valley, or CEHV, the communities emphasize the rebbitzin's role beyond traditional roles, including as a community leader and educator. One of Rabbi Sivan's areas of expertise is gynocentric Judaism, so she's the perfect guest for our second Women's History Month episode. Welcome back to the podcast, Rabbi.
Thank you, Jenny. And hi, Ellen. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we are so thrilled you're here. Thank you so much for joining us. So Jen couldn't join us for today's interview, but we have a very special guest co-host, speaking of iconic women. We've talked about her in nearly every episode of this podcast so far, so it's about time you actually get to hear from the legend herself, Brooklyn-born, challah-baking woman about town in Kingston, my mom, Ellen Leifer. Thanks for being here, Mom, for this special episode.
You're very welcome. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, we are also very excited to have you here. And we are also very excited that we actually get to talk and chat this time, Rabbi, because last time you were on the podcast, it was the recording for the story episode. So first of all, for the people who are hearing the term for the first time, what exactly is gynocentric Judaism?
Yeah. So specifically, I'm a specialist in gynocentric Torah, which is Torah as in the Hebrew Bible or the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible or Jewish literature and teaching writ large. But it's Torah that is centered on the stories and experiences of women.
Fascinating.
Now, when you shared the very exciting and somewhat salacious story of Judith, you mentioned that her story is often overlooked by liberal Jewish congregations. Why is it important to intentionally share stories of women in Jewish history?
Yeah, so those are 2 different questions, I think. Why hasn't Judith been centered and celebrated in liberal Judaism? And I don't know the answer to that question. What I can say, and I think I said this in the episode about Judith, is that Orthodox Jews have kept the tradition of Judith alive. They passed down her story as oral history for centuries. And if you were invited to an Orthodox Hanukkah party, they would absolutely serve cheese in honor of Judith because they have kept her. Somehow, perhaps because the story of Judith, the book of Judith, wasn't canonized, it didn't become a part of the Hebrew Bible. Perhaps for that reason, it was lost to the liberal Jewish community, which doesn't have the same history of oral tradition that the Orthodox community has. So just speculating why Judith didn't make it into the liberal world historically, but she's making a comeback now. She is more and more known in liberal Judaism, and I hope we're all serving cheese now in her honor on Hanukkah.
Well, I hope so too, and that's a party that Jen would want to be at with cheese for sure.
Cheese and salacious women, right?
There you go. Perfect.
Love it.
Good recipe for a party.
Yep.
Yes. Although cheese and the Jews, it's questionable. So the other part of your question, Ellen, why is it important to lift up the stories and experiences of women and women characters in Judaism takes a little bit more unpacking. So historically, for much of Jewish history, Torah and Jewish teaching, Jewish knowledge, Jewish thought, and particularly interpretation of our scripture was done almost exclusively by men. From the time of the period of the rabbis who formed rabbinic Judaism as we know it, and for thousands of years thereafter, men were the teachers, men wrote the commentary, men were the transmitters. And in many parts of the world, for a long time, women were not allowed to study Torah, and they certainly weren't allowed to teach it or to write about it. It's only been since the second wave feminist movement of the 1970s that we have the emergence of a Jewish feminism. And out of that Jewish feminism, we have, for the first time in history, a pervasive subset of the Jewish population that is women teaching Torah, studying Torah, writing commentary about Torah. We now have an incredible bookshelf filled with the teachings of these women, but it's noteworthy that we've only had access to this for the last 50 years. On the grand stage, when we look at all of Jewish history, it's a very, very, very small portion of time when women have actually participated in the teaching and learning and commenting on Torah. Why is it important that women's voices be included in this work? First of all, the Torah has something new to teach every generation. All of us are meant to be learning constantly and relearning and learning new things from Torah. If women don't see themselves in that tradition, then half of the population is not having a mirror. It's not learning from Torah the way that they're meant to, right? Largely in Judaism, in our Siddur, in our prayer book, in our textual tradition, God is thought of as male. And if men are the teachers and men are the commentators, then women are going into Jewish spaces, whether it's a house of study or whether it's a prayer space, and they're not seeing themselves because everything that's being mirrored back to them is male authored, and therefore from the male perspective. So one of the reasons that it's important to have women commentators and women teachers and bring women's voices in is because now half the population is seeing themselves when they're studying Torah. It's not like the stories of women weren't already there. Everything that I teach is already there in our texts, in our tradition. It's just that when men are the ones who are doing the learning and the teaching, they're more likely to have an androcentric lens as opposed to a gynocentric lens. They're more likely to look at this from the male perspective. So I'll give you an example that I like to use. If you ask the average Jewish person, who is the hero of the Passover story? Who's the hero of the Exodus? They're going to say to you who?
Moses.
Moses. Of course, it's Moses. Naturally, it's Moses. But if you actually read the story of the Exodus, if you read it from the beginning, before Moses does anything, you have 5 different women who each make huge contributions in order to ensure that Moses survives. So you have Shiphrah and Puah, the Hebrew midwives, who refuse to follow Pharaoh's orders to kill Hebrew babies, and therefore they ensure that Moses isn't killed, right? Then you have Yocheved, Moses' mother, who hides him for 3 months when he's born, and who then ensures that his basket, when it's put in the Nile, she does follow Pharaoh's orders. She puts the basket in the Nile, but she caulks it so that it will float. So you have her ensuring that he lives. Then you have Miriam, Moses' sister, who stations herself next to the Nile to watch over the ark, the basket, and make sure that Moses survives, and stays until she sees that Moses is found by Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter takes him and chooses to raise him as her own. Yes, Shiphrah, Puah, Yocheved, Miriam, and Batya. 5 women, each of them refusing to follow Pharaoh's order in one way or another, and collectively, even though they didn't know one another and they didn't organize to make this happen, collectively between the 5 of them, they ensure that Moses lives. And by ensuring that Moses lives, then Moses gets to go on to become the leader who saves the Jewish people and frees us from slavery. But without the actions of those 5 women, he never would have lived to see that moment, right? And so for me, if you ask me who the hero of the Exodus story is, it's clearly those 5 women, right? Because without them, we simply wouldn't have had a Moses. That's exactly the same story But the lens that we're putting on it, or as my partner, Rabbi Jack Sherritt, taught me, the twist of the kaleidoscope, the way that we turn the kaleidoscope when we look at Torah, the shift of the kaleidoscope means that either you're looking at the story and saying it's about Moses, and then most of what we're teaching and most of what we're talking about is about Moses being the hero and everyone else is a peripheral character, or you twist that kaleidoscope and the women are at the center and you see the contributions that they make. Now, for those of us who are Jews in the pews, just normal Jews who are studying and encountering this material, what a difference it makes if you are a woman to realize and experience this story through the idea that women are actually the heroes of the story. All of a sudden, you're seeing yourself and women are the inspiration. So it just changes our relationship with our texts and tradition.
It's kind of like this, behind every great man is a great woman or women in
Women,
this case.
plural.
Yeah. Yeah,
so
exactly.
fascinating. And I there's a few things that you said that really stuck out for me. And you're absolutely right. I think it kind of goes back to that saying representation matters. If you're only hearing about androcentric, male-centered stories, which is what we grew up in Hebrew school learning, you really don't feel as connected. There's a bit of a disconnect for a lot of women, for most women. What I found really interesting was, and I was wondering about that because I do remember when I saw you speak about Lilith as well, this idea that it's not as common in the liberal Reform Judaism movement, but you'll hear these stories in the Orthodox, which I personally found sort of counterintuitive because when I think of Orthodox teachings, I do think more androcentric, but that made so much sense that you said they carry on more of the oral stories, not the ones that have been written down and canonized. So that piece was very interesting to me. One of the things also that stuck out in the 5 women that you mentioned, I remember learning this at one point, which was fascinating to me, is that Batya, Pharaoh's daughter who found Moses and raised him as her own, that was not her birth name. That was not her given name, but the name Batya in Hebrew means daughter of God. Is that true that that was not her given name?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we start to learn when we do the work of gynocentric Torah, when we put women's stories and women's experiences at the center, and then look at those stories of women that are actually in our biblical literary tradition, one of the things that we start to learn is how many women are featured, their stories are featured, but the characters are unnamed. They are known as daughter of, wife of, concubine of, sister of, etc. Unnamed women. So a sort of subset of gynocentric Torah is looking at the unnamed women and then trying to give them voice and agency as a way of lifting them up because they historically, like, they were important enough to have a story, but their identity as women wasn't important enough for them to even be given a name. Now the rabbis, this is the rabbis with a capital R, the rabbis who wrote our oral history tradition and who founded rabbinic Judaism, the rabbis recognized this thing about unnamed women and they often gave them names. Another example is the wife of Noah, who is also unnamed in the Bible, but the rabbis named her Naamah. So they had this habit of giving names to the unnamed women. Largely, I would say that there's a lot of gender problems in rabbinic literature. The rabbis sometimes could be misogynist, but they also sometimes could be very progressive in what today we might call feminism. And they often did the work of trying to lift up women and celebrate women. And so we have them to thank for things like the fact that Batya has a name. She wasn't named in the Bible, and then the rabbis called her Batya, which means daughter of God. Why did they give her that name? Because they so valued the contribution that she made. And they decided that she was a daughter of God for having chosen to save Moses. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I mean, you can put it in the podcast, but I might be wrong. I believe she's one of the women that the rabbis lift up as righteous converts. They have a group of women that they imagined converted to Judaism because their faith in God was strong. And I believe that Batya was one of them. There was something else that you said, Jenny, that I wanted to comment on. Give me a second. Let me see if I can remember what it was. Nope. It escaped me, but if I remember it later, I'll bring it up.
Okay, sounds good. And one of the things I had said, I really do believe, I mean, again, that's how I learned in Hebrew school, and that's how my kids learned growing up, was we were aware at some point that these stories, a lot of our rituals, a lot of the things that we need to do according to Jewish law were written and decided by men. There is a lot of fascinating stuff there about it is not necessarily that they saw women as inferior. It was that men needed to do certain things. Women just, they didn't need to do that. They were already at a certain level that they didn't have to do certain things that men had to do. I don't know if I would say they thought they were closer to God or whatever the saying was, but I remember I've heard teachings about the difference between things that, and this is of course in Orthodox Judaism, things that men and women are supposed to do, covering their heads and sitting separate from the men, and they didn't read from Torah and things like that. Yes, there was clearly a lot of misogyny going on, but there was also some level of respect where women were set aside and or set above men in certain ways.
Yes, I once
Yeah.
took a class. I once took a class from an Orthodox rabbi on women and how they look at them as being on a pedestal. I mean, this was his version of it, and
Yeah.
how they were looked up to. So many of the things that say, well, you don't have to do certain mitzvot. It's because she's a woman and she's busy with other things, or she is closer to God. Yeah, it was very interesting. It's that kind of philosophy.
Yeah. So I want to call BS on that.
Do it.
It
Let's
is
get into it.
absolutely something that you will hear. This is absolutely something that you will hear. And I think it's like a kind of pink washing. I actually highly recommend, for anyone who's interested in this idea, I highly recommend the movie The Women's Balcony. It's available on Amazon Prime. It's a Hebrew Israeli movie, but you can watch it with English subtitles. And for a deconstructing of this idea that like, oh, women are just exempt from things, or women cover their hair or whatever because they're closer to God, to really understand that in context and like push back against it, I recommend watching this movie, The Women's Balcony. But I think that the problem is like it would be one thing to have that philosophy and then say, so women are exempt from this if they want to be, but that's not what happens. Instead, what you get is women are forbidden from doing this thing. Women are forbidden from wrapping tefillin, which are the leather straps and boxes that are worn on the arm and on the head by observant male Jews traditionally for prayer. There are just a number of commandments that women, even if they want to do them, are not allowed to do. And so, it's like a really pretty way of oppressing women. I think that idea that it's because women are closer to God, or oh, they're too busy or whatever. Your comment, Jenny, did remind me of the thing that I wanted to say earlier, which is that gynocentric Torah is not just for women by any stretch of the imagination. There's a real misconception that if I am teaching Torah about women and centering women's stories and experiences, that is not Torah about women, but Torah for women. And by and large, when I teach, the majority of people who show up are women. And men feel like they don't actually need to learn this. Like, why do I need to learn this? This is about women. It's clearly for women. But if the normal way that the Torah is taught in Hebrew school, etc., is with men at the center, and everyone in the room is learning that, regardless of the gender of the learner, right? If women are regularly learning about the men of Torah and men's experiences, why wouldn't people, regardless of their gender, also be learning about the experiences of women? I once taught a class where I highlighted the character of Elisheva, who's a character who doesn't have a story in the Bible. Just her name appears in a lineage list, but the rabbis imagined more of a story for her. So I taught what the Bible teaches, that her name is listed in this lineage list, and then I taught what the rabbis teach about her. And what the rabbis teach about her is essentially she's like the original Rebbitzin, or the Rebbitzin of Rebbitzins. She was the wife of either Aaron or of one of his sons. I can't remember at the moment, but she was like this great supporter of the priestly leadership. And after I taught this class, I had somebody write to me, a woman, for the record, I had someone write to me and say, so do you offer any Torah that isn't feminist or that doesn't have a feminist agenda? And I was like, a feminist agenda, right? Like all I did was teach the story of a woman. That was it. I didn't go on and I said she was Rebbitzin of Rebbitzins. This is not like what people imagine as man-hating feminism, right? I wasn't even advocating for gender equality in that particular session, but just putting a woman at the center and teaching her story made someone reach out to me and ask me if I ever offer classes that don't have a feminist agenda. So people can be really resistant to this regardless of their gender. But by and large, I find that men don't think that they need to show up when the subject that's being taught is women. And when, we go back to Ellen's question of like, why is this important? It's not just important that women see themselves in their texts and traditions. It's important that everyone see women when they encounter Torah, that everyone understand that women can be great leaders, that everyone encounter these women's stories. I think that work could go a long way in combating the patriarchal monotheism and misogyny that has come out of that tradition.
Yeah. And I think that even for our listeners who aren't Jewish and other ways to sort of look at this, if you think about women's contributions to, let's say, even US history, women's contributions have largely been overlooked or honestly erased, whether it's politics, science, everyday life, whatever it is. I mean, when I was learning about some political and activist figures recently, and they were huge in our history, I'm like, how in all throughout school, in all the history books, we have never heard of these women who were so key. They were such key figures in all these different movements, and not just say like Alice Paul for the women's suffrage movement. I'm not even talking about the women's movements, but just in general. And thinking about the way that the Constitution was written, there's not one mention of women in the entire Constitution except for the amendment on women's suffrage. And that is because at the time it was written, women were not seen as full citizens. So there's a lot of that, but that was way back then. Why now are we still not learning about these women? So I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's a really good point that yes, it helps representation matters and connecting to it, but you're absolutely right. It's not just for women, it's for everyone to hear about.
Still ahead on this episode, Rabbi Sivan has some thoughts on the importance of community and connection for building resilience and combating loneliness. But you know where you won't be lonely? At the Hudson Valley Wine and Food Festival, coming up September 6th and 7th at the Dutchess County Fairgrounds in Rhinebeck. This annual event is the Northeast's premier festival featuring wineries, distilleries, craft beer, gourmet foods, and artisan vendors, plus live music, cooking demos, expert wine tastings. There are education sessions with local experts like our guest from episode 32, Debbie Jaquindo, the Hudson Valley Wine Goddess. Coming up is your opportunity to get the best price of the year on your tickets. April 1st and 2nd for 48 hours only. You can save 40% with the early bird presale discount at HudsonValleyWineFest.com. Follow the Valley Girls on Instagram at ValleyGirlsPodNY. Join our Facebook group, Valley Girls Podcast Pod Squad, or visit our website at ValleyGirlsPodcast.com. And we promise to remind you on March 31st. We're planning to be at the Hudson Valley Wine and Food Festival on September 6th and 7th, and you should too. Don't miss out. Sip, savor, and celebrate with us this September. Go to HudsonValleyWinefest.com for more.
So you have so many great stories. Who are a couple of your other favorite iconic women from Jewish history?
Yeah, so I am like a pretty big nerd for the Hebrew Bible, right? That's my area of expertise. I was in academia teaching this for a decade before I became a rabbi. It's one of my specialties as a rabbi. So I admire so many women from Jewish history writ large, but like my heroes and my favorites are the women from our literary tradition. So I already talked about the 5 women heroes from the Exodus story. You mentioned briefly Lilith. Lilith doesn't come from the Hebrew Bible. She comes from our Midrash tradition, which is essentially a Jewish fan fiction. And she's my favorite is Lilith. But the character that's in the Bible that is the most like Lilith, who I'm a huge fan of, who we just celebrated last week when we had Purim, is Queen Vashti. So Queen Vashti, I think, is very like Lilith in that Vashti is the wife, she's queen and wife of the Persian king Ahasuerus. And he, after 6 months of drinking with his advisors and his political buddies, he comes home to his capital city and then has another 7 days of drinking. And so everybody's belligerent. And Queen Vashti is having like a low-key women's feast with her women. And he sends a messenger to demand that she come and appear before his advisors and his political buddies and to display her beauty. And she refuses. She refuses to come when she's summoned. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us why she refuses. The rabbis imagine, the Bible tells us she's asked to appear in her crown. The rabbis imagine that she is asked to appear in only her crown, and she refuses to do that. But I think we can read it and say, well, yeah, she didn't want to show up in front of a bunch of drunk dudes who had been drinking for, 6 months and 7 days and were demanding that she come not as the like regal political figure that she was, not as a queen, but just to show off to all of these rowdy drunk men. And she loses her crown and possibly her life for it. But I think that she really is a symbol of consent and what it means to say no and having self-respect. And I think that she teaches us an important lesson that Lilith also teaches us, which is what it costs women when they set these boundaries, what it costs women when they stand up for what they believe in, what it costs women when they refuse to participate in misogynistic situations. It's not free. Right? It hasn't been for any of the women that we would look at in a Jewish history episode. There is going to have been some sort of huge cost to them for standing up and doing what was right.
And it's so interesting because you ask the normal, particular Jew in the pew, as you say, about the story of Purim, and the first thing they'll tell you is about Queen Esther.
Yeah.
They'll never mention Vashti.
Yeah. Queen Esther, also great. Queen Esther is a much more, she gets a lot more airtime in the story. She is celebrated as a Jewish hero, and she is that. But if you actually look at Esther's story, she, first of all, is a victim essentially of Me Too violations, right? The king summons every young virgin in the land to come to him to spend a night with him, so to sleep with him, and then to be conscripted into his harem, and they have no consent and no choice. And so she's brought into his palace under those circumstances. So she's a young virgin who's just essentially like sold into the palace of the Persian king. And she's chosen for a very specific reason. When Vashti refuses to come to the king, his advisors say, you better find a new wife who comes to teach everyone how to obey their husbands. That's the job description for Esther's job. Queen number 2, you're here to show that you're meek, that you're subservient, and that you will obey your husband, so that all the rest of the families in Persia and Media will know that a woman's role is to be subservient and to bow to her husband in that way. So that's her job description. She becomes queen so that she can show everybody how to behave that way. And then when the Jews of Persia are threatened, her guardian, her sort of adopted parent, Mordecai, counsels her that she needs to stand up for the Jewish people. She had hidden her Jewish identity from the king when she married him, and he says, it's time for you to tell him who you are and to advocate for your people. And when she's first told that she needs to do this, she says no. She's afraid. She understands that going to the king unbidden, there's a law on the books that she could lose her life for going to the king unbidden, right? So she's afraid and she says no. And only after Mordecai gives her this speech and says, maybe the whole reason you became queen in the first place is so that you could be here to save your people in this moment. And finally, in that moment, her character shifts. She shifts from being this meek victim to being a real political player. She says, okay, you know what? I'm going to save my people. If I die, I die. And from that moment on, we see her being a savvy, active political leader. And that's the part of Esther that we remember and celebrate. We remember the Esther who stood up to the king, who saved the Jews, who brought the downfall of the villain of the story. But that's only the second half of her story. When we look at her across the board throughout her story, we actually see that she went through a real character development to get there.
Yeah. And it's also interesting to point out that Vashti wasn't Jewish either. She was a Persian queen. And that was part of it, is that Esther, like you mentioned, Esther had to hide her Judaism when she was pranced in front of the king and was married to him. But Vashti, interestingly, as many heroines of some Jewish stories, they were not Jewish women who really stood up and really helped. I don't know if I would want to say she furthered the Jewish cause. Vashti did not do that, but certainly stood up as a woman and was a very powerful figure.
Yeah, I think Vashti furthered women's causes,
Yes.
but I think it took a really long time for that to happen. I think we've only started to recognize Vashti as a Jewish feminist hero again since the 1970s and the second wave feminist movement and the emergence of Jewish feminism. The rabbis, remember how much the rabbis loved Batya, the daughter of Pharaoh, and how they gave her that name and they celebrated her and said she was righteous. The rabbis felt the exact opposite about Vashti. The rabbis really demonized Vashti. They said that she tortured Jews. Like, they made up these stories, right? They said it's fan fiction. They said that she tortured Jews. They imagined that she had a tail, that the reason she didn't want to appear was because she had a tail. So you see some misogyny and some hatred of the other from the rabbis in their treatment of Vashti. It's really only modern Jewish feminists who have started to celebrate her for the first time in history.
Mm.
That's
And
amazing.
for those who were not as fortunate as we were to hear you speak about Lilith, since we've mentioned her a couple of times, could you give a brief, just, I know it's hard for Lilith and for you, a brief explanation of who Lilith was for those who are not familiar with her?
Yeah. So when you read the creation story of humankind in the Bible in Genesis, you'll actually notice that there's two different tellings of the story of the creation of humankind. In Genesis 1, it's a kind of a 30,000-foot view of, humans were created in the image of God. And then in Genesis 2, it's more of a zooming in, and it's the story that's more famous. God puts Adam to sleep. God makes Eve out of Adam's rib, it's usually translated as, but actually the more correct translation would be side. Eve is made out of Adam's side. So, but the rabbis looked at this and said, well, wait a minute. There's a telling of the story of the creation of humankind in Genesis 1, and there's a telling of the story of the creation of humankind in Genesis 2, and they're not the same story. Why are there two different stories? And particularly, it's womankind, the rabbi said, who appears to have been made differently and twice. One time she's made alongside with Adam in the same way at the same time, and the second time she's made from Adam's rib or side. And so from this unanswered question of why are there two stories of the creation of women, the rabbis imagined that actually the woman created in Genesis 1 was a different woman, and that there was a first wife that Adam had before Eve. That the story in Genesis 2 is the creation of Eve, but Genesis 1 is a different first wife of Adam. So the rabbis come up with this idea that Adam had a first wife, and that idea develops in Jewish mythology and lore and rabbinic literature over centuries. And by the time that you get to the Middle Ages, a very famous story is written in a work called the Alphabet of Ben Sirach. And in the Alphabet of Ben Sirach, there's a telling of the story of the creation of that first wife of Adam. And in that story, she is called Lilith. So what that story says is that God created Adam and Lilith at the same time from the same materials in the same way, and therefore they were equal. But Adam, when they coupled, wanted to assume the top position, physically wanted to assume the top position, and that Lilith refused. She said, if we are created equal, we're equal. Why would I be subservient to you in this way? And the two of them could not see eye to eye on this. So Lilith utters God's ineffable name, utters the name of God that no human being is supposed to know how to speak. She utters God's ineffable name, which gives her the magic power to fly, literally fly. She flies out of Eden. She leaves Eden. She leaves paradise, right? She chooses to go and live on her own outside of Eden. And then Adam goes and complains to God and is like, God, the woman that you made for me, she's gone. She won't come back. And God's like, okay, fine. So God sends 3 angels after Lilith in order to bring Lilith back. And the 3 angels go to her and she says, no, she's like, I'm not going back. And then they threaten her and they say, if you do not go back, you are going to lose 100 of your demon babies every day. So notice that now her babies are demons. Lilith has been demonized. The moment that she refuses to accept subservience to Adam and prefers living on her own to being subservient, the men who write her story demonize her. So now all of a sudden, Lilith, who 5 minutes ago was a human, first human woman created, now all of a sudden she's a demon. So they say 100 of your demon babies will die every day. And she prefers this punishment to living a life subservient to Adam. She accepts the punishments. She says, fine, I'm going to stay out here on my own. I'm not coming back. You can kill 100 of my demon babies every day. And then that happens. She stays on her own. She has however many babies every day, and every day 100 of them are killed as her punishment. Meanwhile, God tries again because God realized God didn't do a good job the first time and makes a more fitting wife for Adam. And then that is when we get to Genesis 2 and the creation of Eve. And so in that setup, we often think of Eve as the original kind of bad actor of women, right? Like, especially through a Christian lens, Eve is responsible for original sin. That's not a Jewish concept, it's a Christian concept. But in the Bible, Eve is responsible for the pain that women experience during childbirth, and that's punishment for what she did with the apple. Eve doesn't do a good job, and she's certainly villainized by most of our literary and religious tradition, right? Like, we see Eve as like having not done a great job in Eden. As soon as you bring Lilith in, all of a sudden Lilith becomes a foil for Eve, and now you actually have the sort of original Madonna. And is there a word that I can say that's better than the one that I'd like to say?
Say it. It's okay.
You have the original Madonna and the whore dichotomy, right? So all of a sudden Lilith is really bad because Lilith doesn't accept the gender inferiority of women, right? And Lilith is a demon for that. And now all of a sudden Eve looks good. Eve's the good wife. She's the better choice. God did it right the second time. So it's interesting that like women can't even start to look good, like good people in our tradition until you start pitting them against one another and make one of them bad and one of them good.
That's fascinating.
That really is amazing. So obviously you're a very modern rabbi and very modern Rebbitzin, I have to tell you that. And I noticed on your LinkedIn page, you have a headline that says, Making Judaism Joyous and Accessible. It feels more important than ever, given the current social and political climate. In what ways are you seeing people turn or return to communities of faith during these times?
Yeah, beautiful. I think it's always so important to make Judaism joyous and accessible. One of the reasons that I'm a rabbi in the Reform movement is because of its emphasis on making Judaism accessible to people. And I actually don't think I have to work very hard to make Judaism joyous. I think Judaism is so full of joy. If you just know how to twist that kaleidoscope in order to highlight it, Judaism can bring us so much joy. A big part of my work at Central Synagogue is working in the Center for Exploring Judaism, which is our Intro to Judaism and conversion program. We believe, the largest conversion program in the world. On March 28th, we're going to have our big conversion Shabbat, where we celebrate everyone who has joined the Jewish people through our program in the last year. There are going to be 50 people on stage who joined the Jewish people through our program in the last year, and another at least 50, if not more, coming in on the live stream that aren't in New York City. So we welcome a lot of people to the Jewish people every year through our program. What I have seen since October 7th, and with the resultant anti-Semitism that has been on the rise, incidents of anti-Semitism are up 400% or more since October 7th. What I have seen is maybe not what people would expect. I have seen, and what we have seen in our program at the Center for Exploring Judaism, and the founder and director of this program, Rabbi Lisa Rubin, has a beautiful sermon about this that she gave on Rosh Hashanah this past year. You can find that online. Is a huge increase in people joining the Jewish people. So people who maybe had some sort of Jewish ancestry, parentage, etc., but didn't really grow up, with Jewish holidays and traditions, and felt that there was something Jewish about them, but didn't feel fully Jewish, have decided to affirm their Jewish identity through the program. People who were living Jewish adjacent lives, Jewish plus lives, where they were in Jewish plus households and families, and always were a part of Jewish life, but weren't themselves Jewish, now find it very important to be Jewish and stand with the Jewish people in that moment in the wake of October 7th. So that's what I've seen in terms of people joining the Jewish people. And in terms of Jews across the board, whether they were born into Judaism or they chose Judaism, a sharp increase in people's pride in their Jewish identity, in people's orientation towards Jewish community, in going to Shabbat services at a synagogue, or having people over for Shabbat dinner, or going to Shabbat dinners, celebrating holidays, people who maybe felt like Judaism was, a part of their identity before, but wasn't necessarily at the forefront of their life, all of a sudden are turning to Judaism, and really it is a very important part of their identity now. When I look at, one of the things I did in rabbinical school is spent a lot of time studying the history of anti-Semitism. And I would just read over and over again about Jews suffering pogroms, Jews suffering exiles, Jews suffering forced conversions, the Holocaust, just time after time after time, in place after place after place, anti-Semitism rearing its ugly head and the Jews suffering. And it was a very depressing thing to study. And when I was studying it, I was always like, but how? Why are we still here? right? Like the Romans oppressed us and destroyed our temple. The Romans don't exist anymore. Why do we still exist? So often the people who oppressed us aren't necessarily here anymore, but we still are. Why? And I never understood it when I was studying anti-Semitism in the history books. But now that I have lived through October 7th and this period of anti-Semitism that we are in now, I see very clearly why we have survived and why we are still here, which is that in moments of oppression, the Jewish people turn inward. And I don't mean inward into ourselves, I mean inward into Jewish community and the Jewish people. We hold one another up. We do Jewish together. There are so many people today who tell me, I can't talk about Judaism with my non-Jewish friends. I can't talk certainly about Israel with my non-Jewish friends. It's not a safe space for me to be Jewish in the way that I am with people who aren't Jewish. But when I'm with my Jewish community, I feel safe, right? So I am seeing this recommitment to and rededication of and recentering of Jewish community and Jewish life and Jewish identity as actually the way we've always responded to moments such as this.
And how does your focus on gynocentric Judaism tie into all of this, if it does at all?
Well, I certainly think that I bring the joy when I bring gynocentric Torah.
We agree.
Even when the stories that we're encountering are hard, and some of them are, sometimes really difficult things happen to these women, and these women suffer pretty terrible things in their stories. The feeling of encountering these stories that have always been right in front of you, but that maybe you've never read before because nobody ever bothered to twist the kaleidoscope in that way. The feeling and the reinforcement of your own Jewish identity when you suddenly see yourself in your texts and traditions, it brings people pride, it brings people joy. We always have a lot of fun when I teach. I like to laugh, I like self-effacing humor, I like to facilitate discussions rather than lecture. So there's lots of ways that I try to bring the joy when I teach these things. But I think that just the practice of centering women's stories and women's experiences brings joy to people. And of course, we're talking about accessibility. Like, how inaccessible is it to be a woman and go into your prayer space and only hear about God spoken of in male terms and never see yourself reflected in the divine, right? How accessible is it when you actually understand that historically, the Jews, the Hebrews, the Israelites worshiped the divine feminine before we became exclusively monotheistic, or that God, the one God that we believe in today, one of God's names is El Shaddai, which means the many-breasted God, or that there are metaphors of God as a nursing mother, that there are actually ways that women are celebrated even in, like, God is not exclusively male. When God creates humankind in Genesis 1, God says, let us make humankind in our image to be like us. God speaks of God's self in the plural, basically making God non-binary, right? So there are all of these ways that this is making our Torah, our texts and traditions that are already there, so much more accessible to people. Now it's not only accessible to men, it's accessible to all genders, right? So I think that the practice is very much about making Judaism joyous and accessible.
Love that. Love all of that. And as I mentioned earlier, obviously not everyone listening to this podcast is Jewish, and many people don't identify with any particular religion. But I still think that we're all struggling to make sense of turbulent times right now. So what lessons have you learned throughout your years of study and your years of teaching about resilience and hope, whether they come from the Jewish tradition or otherwise, that might really resonate with anyone who is struggling to find meaning right now?
Yeah, I think that the Jewish people are inherently a resilient people. And I think that that resilience comes from time and time again a historical need to turn toward, into, and support Jewish community. I think Judaism's emphasis on community is actually directly tied to its resilience. And I think that the focus on community, the emphasis on community, can instill resilience in any person, whether they're in a Jewish community or otherwise. I think that we are largely at a point in history in America where there have been many ways that community has been eradicated. Most of us don't know our neighbors. Not a lot of us, like many of us, live far away from our families. Not a lot of people feel that they have a strong and vibrant community. Certainly not a community that like they could rely on if all of a sudden one day they have a childcare shortage or if they get sick and they need somebody to bring them a meal. But if you think about the America that my mom grew up in, my mom was born in 1949. If you think about the America my mom grew up in, she knew all of her neighbors. Everyone took care of one another, right? There was a real sense of community that I think has been eroded in the last 75 years in America. So I think that if we want to pull something from Judaism that can teach us all about resilience, it's the emphasis on community, that the more work we put into building community, feeding community, and taking care of one another, the more support we will have in a micro way, like in the people immediately around us. We may feel really out of control of our governments and policies and what's going on in this bigger sense in the world. But if we have people we can talk to, and we have people we can laugh with, and we have people who will show up for us when we're in need, that sense of community will combat how you feel as an individual in this larger world that you otherwise have so little control over.
That's beautiful.
Literally, those are the words I was
Yes.
just going to use. That is
Absolutely beautiful.
so beautiful. It's a beautiful way of looking at it, and it is so real. And one thing, this is just a small microcosm here. We are in the Hudson Valley of a larger everything that's going on. But that's one of the things that we've said over and over within this podcast is one thing that we all love about our region is that sense of community. And I think it can come from like a physical location, like here we are in the Hudson Valley. It can come from a group of people who are like-minded, but that is a big part of it. And also, I think that we're talking about turbulent times with sociopolitical stuff going on right now, but it was not that long ago that we were all so isolated during the pandemic that we suddenly realized, wow, we need that community. We really need that. And we had all gotten wrapped up in the rat race and crazy life, but well, some thrived in the isolation. The majority that we see, whether it's the mental health crisis that happened or all of that, we see that people really craved community. And so I hope that that doesn't get lost again over, I think that it's still not what it was. I mean, my mother too, same year, 1949. It's definitely a different world now for our generation, but I do think that there are glimpses of that realization that we still all need each other. We need to take care of each other and how important community is. So that's a really beautiful way of looking at it. Thank you.
Yeah, and that mental health crisis that was exacerbated by COVID was only exacerbated by COVID. It was
Correct.
already in the
Right.
works. There was a 2020 study that came out from Harvard on loneliness. So the study had been carried out in the years before, and then it's written and published in 2020. And the study found that there's a loneliness epidemic in America today, and that the epidemic is actually a health crisis, that it is almost as dangerous as heart disease. And so who were the loneliest people? Elderly, as we would imagine. I believe it was the second loneliest group of people, according to that study, was mothers of young children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So but like, look at what the crisis is. The crisis is loneliness. What is the opposite of loneliness, or the antidote or the solution to loneliness? It's community, right?
Yeah.
So community can directly actually be solving and combating these mental health crises.
And I'll also add, just because of my background, I'm a nurse, but also former massage therapist and hospice massage therapist, and doing a lot of that work. I taught classes, I taught workshops in how to communicate compassion through touch to people who were not massage therapists, who were not nurses. And that I will probably like add a little asterisk next to community and connection, because for some people, they're very introverted. Like I said, they're the ones that maybe they did suffer from loneliness. I'm sure they did, but in a sense, they kind of thrived because there wasn't a pressure for them to have to go out but they still missed some form of connection. So even if you're somebody who is not into being in a large gathering of community, just that sense of connection with other people, even if it's one other person that you have a connection with, is, I would say, a really powerful way to combat loneliness, is just find that one connection. And one of the studies that I used to teach about actually was about, they took newborns and they had basically surrogate grandparents for them who would come, and they were unfortunately, these are children who were orphaned, and they had these surrogate grandparents come and spend time with them, pick them up from their cribs and play with them, touch them. And while they were looking for the response, how that affected the children, what they were not expecting was they also measured depression levels based on their own reports before and after the study. And for all of the elderly, their levels of depression had gone down considerably after spending time. So it's not that they were spending time with peers, people they could talk to. It was just that connection and being able to be there. They were the ones who were providing the care and the service, but they benefited so much from that. So taking care of each other is not just benefiting the one that you're taking care of, but there really is something to be said about caring for each other and how that makes us feel as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And humans need a sense of purpose.
Yes.
Right? So if you are providing care for someone else, you are needed and you have value. And that is also invaluable. And that is something that inevitably happens when you're in community. When you're in community, different people play different roles and make different contributions, and everyone ends up having a sense of purpose and being needed. It's not just about what you receive, it's also about what others need from you and what that does for us as humans. Remember that humans are naturally communal beings. Before the Industrial Revolution, for all of human history, we lived in multi-generational and village orientations. It's actually only since the Industrial Revolution and the developments of America since then that we have seen this nuclear family model, which is inherently not a communal model. But your point about introverts is important. Introverts are not people who don't need community. They're just people for whom being in large groups, it can be overwhelming, or spending too much time with other people can be overwhelming. But introverts often need, because they are human too, introverts need to be in interpersonal relationship. Also, it's just that often what's best for introverts is one-on-one interactions as opposed to groups.
And also then they need that time. The way they recharge their energy is alone time, but that doesn't mean they don't need that interpersonal connection in between those times. So important. Rabbi Sivan, thank you so much. This has been such a joy and an honor to talk with you. And we're just so thrilled that you're able to join us.
It's been
Thank
delightful.
you. It's been such a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to be here on the Valley Girls podcast. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for listening. Please like and subscribe, rate and review, because as we know, it all helps tremendously. Do you love the Valley Girls? Tell a friend. Have ideas for the podcast? Tell us. The easiest way to chat with us is our Facebook group, Valley Girls Podcast Pod Squad, or you can contact us through our website, valleygirlspodcast.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletter so you never miss a thing. And of course, we're on Instagram at valleygirlspodny. We can't wait to hear from you. Oh, and do you love our theme music as much as we do? The music for this episode is by Robert Burke Warren, entitled Painting a Vast Blue Sky, and can be found on his album Red-Headed Friend, available on iTunes and Spotify, and at the link in the show notes. Bye for now.